Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Welcome to Talk Gertie to Me, the Charm Patterns podcast, where we chat vintage glamour, sewing, creative rabbit holes, and fashion history, all through a campy, queer, and feminist pop culture lens. So throw on your favorite silk robe, grab a mocktail, and let's get started. Hello, everyone. I am back today with another solo podcast. And today I'm going to be talking about caftans, and specifically Caftans and Elizabeth Taylor. So, a little context on why I wanted to do this subject specifically. We released the Elizabeth caftan pattern a month ago, last month, and I've wanted to do a caftan for a long time. And you really can't talk about caftans without talking about Elizabeth Taylor. She was so well known for wearing them. Another reason I love caftans is because I feel like they are very prevalent in two of my favorite vacation spots. The first being Provincetown, Massachusetts, where you've probably heard me talk about this, but I've been going to what we call P-Town with a group of friends, the same group of friends, for about 8 years now. And I go for 2 weeks every summer, and I look forward to it all year. And P-Town is essentially a gay resort town in Cape Cod, and it's quite beautiful and charming. And one thing to know about P-Town is that caftans are very popular there. So, pretty much everyone loves a caftan there. There are caftan parties. There is a group of men that I affectionately refer to as the Caftan Mafia, because you see this group of men sort of parading down Commercial Street, the main street, in their caftans and high heels. And it's just sort of a favorite look in P-Town. And then the other place I love to vacation is Palm Springs, which is another gay resort town. This one is in the desert in California. And Palm Springs is known for its love of caftans. It is the land of caftans. You can go to a vintage shop and find caftans. You can go to a boutique and find indie designer caftans. You can go to some of the big, like Trina Turk is based there. There's Lily Pulitzer. Trina Turk especially is known for designing caftans, things with feathers. You can find things wear by the pool. But the caftan is very, very popular in Palm Springs. And I think, the two are sort of inextricably linked in my head. Caftans belong in Palm Springs. So there's an interesting connection here for me. Why was Elizabeth Taylor known for caftans, for her love of caftans? Why do gay men love caftans so much? Why do queer people love caftans so much? And how did they come to be popular in these two gay resort towns in the US? So, I don't know. I feel like a lot of designs we do, I don't have this sort of like urge to know, but why? What is this connection? Why did this happen? Why did this moment in fashion history happen? And but caftans really brings it up for me because it's such an unlikely sort of direction for fashion to go in after sort of the old Hollywood era and the era in which Elizabeth Taylor made her debut, right? So this question has been sort of nagging at me for a while. And as you know, I'm not a fashion historian. I am someone who loves fashion history and obviously loves vintage fashion. But I'm not going to be the person who's going to give you the most accurate, the most detailed lecture on the history of the caftan. Okay, so I'm just straight up telling you that now. I am going to try to paint you a sort of nuanced picture of this particular moment in Hollywood history and how it has sort of carried into today, specifically in queer communities. Let's go back to the moment that I fell in love with caftans. I think it would probably be Elizabeth Taylor wearing this blue silk chiffon caftan. And it has sort of a metallic sheen to it. And she is doing what can only be described as swanning. And I feel like the word swanning comes up a lot in relationship to robes and caftans. And just side note, last time I recorded one of these solo podcasts, I was sitting on my couch with Millie, wearing a silk kimono a silk robe. And this time, of course, I adapted that. I am now sitting in a silk Elizabeth caftan. That was our pattern that we released on Patreon. It just felt very important to be in the moment. I love this for the podcasting lifestyle. Sitting on a velvet couch, wearing a silk caftan, and I've got my little poodle companion by my side. Okay, so but back to Elizabeth Taylor and her blue silk chiffon caftan. So in this photo, I never really knew where it was from or what year it was from. I know it wasn't her early days because she's definitely there was a point in her career where she transitioned to like bigger hair and more flamboyance. And in this photo, she definitely has like the big hair. She's wearing so this caftan is sort of like cinched at the waist and she is swanning. She is actively swanning. The thing is, though, I could never figure out where this photo came from. Was it from a movie? Was this just a promotional shot? And finally, I got some answers recently. So this caftan was worn in a film that was made in 1974 called That's Entertainment. And it's hilarious, I have to say. You know those like CDs that are called Now That's What I Call Music? It was basically that, but for the old Hollywood era. So it was like a clip film of some of the great performances of the golden age of Hollywood. And it had, big stars doing introductions in between the segments. And Elizabeth Taylor was one of them. And so I was able to find, through the help of our research assistant, Theo, I was able to find the exact moment in this film where she appears in the caftan because I'll be honest, I'm not going to sit through 2 hours of this clip show to find a caftan. But Theo did it. I'm so excited because, and I will link you to this, it's on YouTube. There is a moment where, lights up and Elizabeth Taylor swans down a grand staircase wearing this caftan. And I'm so glad I saw it because you can see the way it moves. You can see how gorgeous and glamorous she looks in it. And I think that's the moment when you're like, of course she loved wearing caftans. There is something so dramatic about them. Not just the way they look, but the way that they feel. And I will say, if you have not tried wearing caftan yet, I just urge you to do it. It is one of the most sort of luxurious, freeing, just a glamorous feeling in a garment, but also one that does not touch your body, which is a really beautiful thing sometimes. And so watching Elizabeth Taylor swan about in this caftan, I feel like I got it. I got why she loved it. But how? Where did this journey start and where did it end? So Elizabeth Taylor became known for her love of caftans later in life. So much so that she had a huge collection. And when she died, they were auctioned off by Christie's. Some of them, went for thousands and thousands of dollars. A lot of them were acquired by Naomi Campbell, of all people. And during the pandemic, she talked about how that was her favorite, her favorite pandemic outfit. The rest of us were wearing sweatpants. Naomi Campbell was wearing Elizabeth Taylor's collection of caftans, which I just love. So there is a short page on Elizabeth Taylor, the Elizabeth Taylor website, which the subject is Elizabeth Taylor and caftans. And they don't give a real reason either, like not a real, there's no moment they pinpoint in her life that she became enamored by caftans. There was sort of an acknowledgement of a rumor that she adopted wearing caftans because of weight gain later in life. And this is just a side note, and we will get more into this, but Elizabeth Taylor is one of the women who was most in the public eye throughout a lot of the 20th century, right? She, I just read a quote from her saying that she does not remember not being famous. That's how young she was when she was sort of catapulted into fame and to Hollywood. She was in the public eye for so, so long. She was known for being incredibly beautiful, and she had to age publicly. And this is something that I think about a lot. Your image changes obviously as you get older, and hers really did. And I think people, would almost like to laugh at her a little bit. There was the White Diamonds campaigns, there were her friendships like with Michael Jackson. And she was looked at as sort of an eccentric figure, and I think judged really harshly for the way her appearance changed. And I would like that to be part of this conversation in general, just that she had to be in the public eye as an aging woman and how that must have affected her psyche, really, and informed what she wanted to wear and what she felt comfortable wearing. However, I will say that on the Elizabeth Taylor website, Richard Burton, one of her famous loves, she was, oh, of course, how can I not mention that she was ridiculed for being married as many times as she was? She had a really tumultuous love life. She married Richard Burton twice, in fact, and he's going to come up a few times today. So he was directly quoted as saying that was bollocks, and that she adopted kaftans because of weight gain. And so who knows? I mean, I have a feeling looking at her, and one movie I always think of is A Place in the Sun, which is one of my favorite movies of hers, oddly enough. It's an early film with Montgomery Clift, and she wears this dress, and it's a white strapless cocktail, party dress with a huge tulle skirt, and it has the bust line is accentuated by these little floral appliques, and it's gorgeous. It's one of my favorite dresses from this era. She had an impossibly tiny waist at this time. You can sense by looking at photos of her how incredibly constricted she was in the costumes that she wore at this time. And the photo shoot she did, her body was constantly constrained. I can't imagine she was comfortable during the filming of this movie. And I think we all know in this community sort of like what a 50s fit and flare silhouette can feel like, especially with like the right undergarments and corseting. It's not the most comfortable silhouette. So thinking how she was so in the public eye, so scrutinized, I love the idea that maybe kaftans were her moment of giving up caring what people thought of her and what they thought of her body, and also giving way to not being uncomfortable all the time, that she'd spent long enough in the public eye being uncomfortable. That's what it feels like to me. Also, I will say we have to talk about Cleopatra when we talk about Elizabeth Taylor and kaftans. So Cleopatra is a 5-hour long movie about Cleopatra in which Elizabeth Taylor stars as Cleopatra. The costumes are incredible, absolutely incredible. And some of them bear really no resemblance to, traditional Egyptian garb. And others are more directly inspired and maybe a little historically accurate. But this movie was insane for a lot of reasons. It had some of the biggest spectacles that had ever been produced, and probably still sets some records for, the sheer number of extras, the amount of costumes, the spectacle of it all. And it's also very well known for going incredibly over budget. So this film was sort of a disaster in a lot of ways, but also it's fascinating to watch. I have never actually gotten through all 5 hours, but I would recommend watching at least some of it. This movie was also plagued by personal scandals for Elizabeth Taylor. She had a really sudden illness. She had to have like an emergency tracheotomy during the filming of this movie, which I didn't know, and that is insane. And during a lot of the scenes, apparently you can see the evidence of it, which I didn't notice, but I just read that story recently. And then, of course, this movie is where she met Richard Burton. So the two of them were both respectively married to other spouses at the time, and they started this like smoldering love affair that would be sort of wrought with drama. And the famous thing about them is that I think they were married to each other twice. I think the film Cleopatra is probably where she became aware of another style of dressing, one that didn't have to constrain her all the time. So you can see some of the garments from Cleopatra. There's one in specific that was sort of more of a long robe that had decorative embroidery on it, very loose from the body. And of course, I'll share this in the show notes as well, that apparently Elizabeth Taylor took from the set to keep. So it definitely had some sort of impact on her. And I do think that perhaps the filming of this movie is the first time she got sort of a taste of this almost like goddess style of dressing, and the idea that you didn't have to be cinched within an inch of your life to look and feel glamorous. Of course, some of the Cleopatra looks were definitely cinched within an inch of her life still. Interesting side note, I also read that Elizabeth Taylor did her own makeup throughout her entire career, and including for the film Cleopatra, which, you know, she was a lovely woman, obviously. I do wonder what a professional makeup artist could have done for the movie Cleopatra, but that is neither here nor there. So I did a little bit of digging, all right? And this is where I get into the disclaimers again about not being a fashion historian. But I did a little bit of digging into what the traditional, historically accurate types of garments would have been during the actual era of Cleopatra, the historical figure. And the Egyptian garment of that time would have been the calasiris, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it was really a single rectangle of linen that would be wrapped around the body and, interestingly, like cinched in a very specific way under the bust. And a lot of the illustrations and photos of these, obviously a lot of these are just recreations of what historians believed would have been worn. But the interesting thing about this type of garment is that the cinching under the bust really makes it look like our Elizabeth kaftan, which I can talk more about that pattern later, but I didn't invent it. This is a style of kaftan sort of more in the mid-20th century that had the effect of the loose flowing garment, but then also the effect of a little cinched waist. Our Elizabeth kaftan does have elastic on the inside that you cinch just to hold the pleating and the folds of the bodice close under the bust. And that's what gives you a more cinched silhouette. And then, of course, this led me into kaftan history. What are kaftans? Where do they come from? I think in this modern day and age, and from my vantage point, which is living in the US, a kaftan, I do think of Elizabeth Taylor. I think of 20th century, mid-century Hollywood stars. I think of Palm Springs and how it was a sort of Hollywood vacation spot in the mid-century. So I think of all those things. But of course, that is not where the kaftan originated. It's a garment that is worn in a lot of different countries. And you can't really pinpoint it to one specific culture, but it's related to a garment that originated in ancient Mesopotamia, and this would have been like 600 BC. And it eventually spread across many different countries and cultures. You can see versions of it in the Middle East. You can see versions of it across Asia and across Northern Africa. It's not a religious garment. It is worn by both men and women. It can be very heavily embellished. The heavily embellished ones are sort of a sign of social standing, right? The simple one would be, a more modest social standing. Is also in some Muslim cultures known for being a style of modest dress because it obviously covers a lot of the body. Another thing to think about with a kaftan is climate, right? Actual weather. I'm not talking about the political climate. So the kaftan is popular in places where the climate is very warm, often unbearably warm. It is known for being floaty. It doesn't touch your body. And when made in something like linen, something very breathable, it's going to be one of the most comfortable things. Also protects you from the sun. It kind of explains why it became popular in like desert towns like Palm Springs. This is where I have to say that I looked at photos of Elizabeth Taylor's collection that was sold at Christie's, and there's something about it that I think from my current vantage point feels almost a little bit uncomfortable. There's definitely a lot of different cultural influences in her collection. And they are not sort of like the Hollywood glam caftans that you think of. I think she definitely was like looking at other cultures. She became interested in other cultural approaches to dress and to the kaftan. From my modern vantage point, there's been a lot of talk about cultural appropriation in relation to sewing patterns, in relationship to fashion. So I think where we stand right now, I think it would be a little uncomfortable for Elizabeth Taylor to have such a multicultural collection of garments and to wear them like on the red carpet, let's say. But Elizabeth Taylor was not cultivating this collection in this moment. And when you look back at the moments when she started becoming interested in these kaftans, it would have been the 60s, the 70s. An interest in other cultures was actually seen as a positive thing. It was seen as a sort of sign of intellectualism. Think of how we associate hippies and bohemians with having an interest in other cultures, wearing garments from other cultures. And so at the time, I think probably wearing a kaftan from the Middle East or from Asia and adopting it as her dress would have been seen as someone who was savvy or worldly. And now, I mean, have shifted, right? And we can't look at this through our modern lens. I think someone, a white American woman who only dressed in, let's say, Middle Eastern kaftans might be seen as problematic. So I did want to point that out because anytime you research kaftans and how they became popular in the US, there is an aspect of exoticizing other cultures or non-Western cultures. So I think it's important to acknowledge it. I don't think it means that we can't talk about kaftans or wear kaftans, but I think that is something that has to be part of the conversation. So how did kaftans make their way to Western culture? So the 20th century, there were some fashion designers, and one that really stands out is Paul Poiret, who was known for these sort of sack dresses, right? And these were definitely sort of Asian-inspired, loose garments and could be seen as a precursor to the Hollywood kaftan. That's what I'm going to call it, right? The Hollywood kaftan. The kaftan of Elizabeth Taylor's age. Norma Desmond would wear one, okay? Let's just call it the Hollywood kaftan. Then in the 50s, there was the Balenciaga sack dress. So I think this is important too, because when you think of 50s fashion, and I think about so much of my work, which is influenced by Christian Dior's new look, so the 1947 sort of movement by Christian Dior of like very cinched waist, this hourglass figure. But Balenciaga at the same time in the 50s was developing the opposite silhouette, right? So what he called his sack dress. And some of them were sort of like constrained at the bottom. So you got this sort of cocoon effect. And they were really beautiful. But it was just such a distinct parallel universe to what was happening with Dior and the new look. So I think that Paul Poiret and Balenciaga sort of developed, there was a sort of interest in looser garments, less constricting garments. And then I think it became adopted by the Hollywood glam set, including people like Elizabeth Taylor, Diana Vreeland. And then let's talk a little bit now about how, and this is what I'm so fascinated by, how did kaftans become a favorite of gay men, of queer communities? And what is the connection between Elizabeth Taylor and Hollywood and that queer adoption of kaftans? One thing that I did not know about Elizabeth Taylor, and I'm sure there's a ton I don't know about Elizabeth Taylor, but one thing I did not know is that she was an AIDS activist. She had a circle of gay male friends. One notable one would have been Rock Hudson, who was a celebrity who died of AIDS. She was very good friends with Elton John. She was so disturbed by what she saw going on with the AIDS crisis and her circle of gay male friends, and was incredibly outspoken in a way that I admire so much. So I'm looking at a Vanity Fair article right now, and this is what they call the AIDS shot heard round the world. It was front page news. Elizabeth Taylor directly addressed George Bush, President George Bush, by calling him out. She said, "I don't think President Bush is doing anything at all about AIDS," said Taylor to a packed press conference in Amsterdam at the 8th International Conference on AIDS. "In fact, I'm not even sure if he knows how to spell AIDS." So she was very, very influential. She did not understand why no one was actually addressing this problem. Politicians, celebrities were all afraid to speak out about the AIDS crisis. And she was one of these people who was incredibly brave in her approach to it. So in 1985, Taylor helped launch AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. And that was one of the first major AIDS research foundations. She served as their founding national chairman. And between 1991 and 2007, and almost until her death in 2011, Elizabeth Taylor continued to host benefits and fundraisers for her foundation and other organizations which were helping people living with HIV and AIDS. So she had a very close connection with the queer community. She was an advocate for gay men. She was an advocate for people living with HIV and AIDS in an incredible way. Elizabeth Taylor also had a connection to Palm Springs. She owned a house there, which I didn't realize until I was doing the little sneak peek hint for the Elizabeth Caftan on Patreon. I was trying to think what would be a photo that I could use that wouldn't clue you into it being a caftan. And I ended up sharing a photo of Elizabeth Taylor's home in Palm Springs. So she was directly tied to Palm Springs, and she made that her sort of home away from home. Let's talk a little bit more about what the kaftan means in sort of a queer context. And there are a couple things I want to bring up here, one of which would be Rudy Gernreich, who was a fashion designer who was probably best known for his swimsuit design called the monokini, which was completely bare on top. And he had this idea of genderless dressing. He was way ahead of his time in this respect. This idea of non-gender conforming dress. So his designs could be worn by men, women, in a unisex way. He also was against the idea of restrictive clothing. And he really proposed the idea of the kaftan as liberation from restrictive clothing. He had this muse named Peggy Moffat, and she was a longtime friend of his. And she said of his kaftans, "To me, the whole point of a kaftan is freedom. The advocates of couture dressmaking, almost always men, have said to me for years that such and such a dress is wonderful because it is so stiff and constructed that it can stand up on the floor all by itself. My reply has always been, let it. It doesn't need me to hold it up, and I don't need the torture it will give me." So really, that was a direct sort of dig at the new look, and designers like Charles James, people who would have been constructing these bodices that could stand on their own. And I think Rudy Gernreich is really interesting in this concept because he was a gay designer and believed in this concept of genderless dressing. And there is something about the kaftan itself that is unisex, right? It does not adhere to any gender binary. And then I was thinking about people like Andre Leontali, who was the creative director at Vogue magazine, a very much larger than life person. He was 6'6", and he was known for wearing kaftans as well. And so I think somewhere along the way, kaftans became associated with fabulousness. And that makes so much sense to me. Andre Leontali also had a collection of personal kaftans that were auctioned at Christie's, and some of his went for like $20,000, which is amazing to me. And looking more into this, I need to read more about Andre Leontali. I, of course, know of him and can picture him in my mind's eye, but he wrote an autobiography called The Chiffon Trenches, which I just love that name so much, so that's going to be my next summer read. I hope that some of these connections make sense. So obviously, Elizabeth Taylor came to her love of kaftans. She had obviously a really strong circle of queer men around her. and continue to be an advocate for them. There was this idea of fabulous dressing that was adopted by gay men a lot of in these resort communities as an item an item of clothing where you are not restricted by the gender binary and you are also not restricted in your body at all. So that's all to say, these are just some of the things that went into creating the Elizabeth caftan pattern. And the thing about caftans is there's such a history of them in the sewing community too, right? Because I think one of the patterns that we all know and love for a caftan is a Simplicity 70s pattern, which has been reissued and is pretty similar to the Elizabeth caftan, which we released because this was just an iconic design of the time and one that I thought that we could make improvements on. So this idea of the little belt that goes underneath the bust, the sort of surplice bodice and gathering at the bust and below the bust that gets cinched on the inside of the caftan with an elastic waist. That was a sort of enduring caftan design and one that I have seen sewn by so many people in the sewing blogosphere and now on Instagram and etc. So I'm really glad that Charm could add its take to the caftan. Believe it or not, fit can be really important with caftans because you need the length in the bust so that it doesn't dig into the back of your neck when you cinch it under your waist. So I was really glad we were able to contribute cup sizes to this type of pattern. I will also say that caftans can bring up some interesting sewing challenges, right? So one of the things that can make them challenging is that the fabrics used for maximum fabulousness would be things like silk chiffon. And as I've been quoted recently as saying, I do think silk chiffon is the devil's fabric. It is so hard to sew because it is so, well, this is what Andrea would say. She would say it's woodgily. And it just totally, you can do everything possible to cut it painstakingly and accurately. And one thing that I like to do is use layers of tissue paper to sandwich the silk chiffon in and then use a rotary cutter. So you cut it out, it perfectly matches the pattern piece, right? I'll be looking at it, I'll be like, this is it. I did it. I cut it out perfectly. And then you unpin it from the pattern piece. And it's like it does like an interpretive dance or something. It is like it takes on an entirely new form because of the way the fibers move. And so sometimes you cannot get it to match its original form, which is why, silk chiffon is great for sewing something like a rectangular shaped caftan. So in things like the Elizabeth caftan, one out of silk chiffon, you would want to underline the belt in something like silk organza or, something with a little more stability to it so that your chiffon isn't dancing all over the place. Another challenge of caftans that I discovered is what do you wear underneath them, right? Because I had this silk burnout chiffon caftan. I took it to Palm Springs. I wanted to wear it out to my birthday dinner. And I used white elastic on the inside. And I wore it over like huge black underwear. And I was thinking, oh, this will give me plenty of coverage. All you could see was like the white band in the back. And so it's interesting. You don't really want to line a caftan, but I think, think about the color elastic that you're using is going to be my big tip. And also like maybe some giant panties are a good idea or little bike shorts underneath, something like that. I also think personally, I believe you should not have to wear a bra with a caftan. That is my personal political stance. So one thing that I like to do is use those little like nipple covers or something like that. Or you could do something like sandwich bra cups in between the lining on the caftan bodice pieces. So we released the Elizabeth caftan. We also released the Pride caftan. The more I looked into this connection between Elizabeth Taylor, between the communities in Palm Springs and P-Town, I wanted to have a sort of non-binary version, right? The sort of Rudy Gernreich version of a caftan that would be genderless. And so I was really excited by that idea. So that one, it doesn't have the bust shaping. It's definitely more of a rectangle, has a V-neck. One really tricky thing about sewing that V-neck is that you do have to do like a little bias facing, which can be quite tricky with slippery fabrics like chiffon or charmeuse or crepe. So really take your time with the sewing of that because that V-neck is super important. Okay, so these are all my thoughts on kaftans, and I really wanted to try to figure out what are the connections here between Elizabeth Taylor, between P-Town, between Provincetown, and between like queer cultures. And I think overall, to me, the sort of enduring idea here is letting go of constraints of clothing or of gender and literally feeling free in your body in a garment. And whether you're a woman, a cis woman who has felt, corseted her entire life and you put on a kaftan and you feel freed, or you're a queer person who is exploring your gender identity and you don't want to wear a gendered item of clothing, you have felt restricted by the genderedness of clothing your entire life, you can put on something like a kaftan and also feel free in it. So I think overall, the feeling I walked away with was just this garment can equal freedom in your body in so many different ways for people. And I love that it's part of this Hollywood history, especially this year that we're doing Hollywood icons. So thank you for listening to my musings and ideas on this. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I will see you next time. Goodbye. Well, hello again, and thank you so much for joining me. That's it for this installment of Talk Gertie to Me. If I had to guess, I'd probably say this episode included a lot of fashion and pop culture references, some of which are best enjoyed in a more visual medium. So be sure to check the show notes for images and links.